Hello and welcome to the screencast for Political Philosophy, Lehman College, Spring 2020. This is the second video or set of videos on human capabilities, female human beings by Martha Nussbaum. So we are starting in the middle of this article on page 519. And the capability approach, which is what she set up in the first half of her article, has two thresholds. The first list was human ways of life or ways of being. What do we all have in common? What kinds of activities and traits do every single group of people share in? So this is the threshold that makes you part of the moral or political community. Then the second threshold is the capability to participate fully in these ways of life. So the goal for any society, Nussbaum says, should be to move as many people as possible from threshold 1 up above threshold 2. So how does Nussbaum see this happening? How can we implement this capability approach in the real world? She says right at the beginning of this section, the role of the conception in development policy. My claim is that we urgently need a conception of the human being and human functioning in public policy. If we try to do without this sort of guidance, when we ask how goods, resources, and opportunities should be distributed, we reject guidance that is, I think, superior to that offered by any other guides currently available. So she doesn't think that the capabilities approach is detailed enough, and this is on purpose, to create concrete policy, concrete law that is embedded in the context of each community, each nation. Instead, it's a background set of principles or guidelines, or even values that we should be aiming when we create laws, when we create policy. So on the next slide, I have a graph or a chart to help us see how this capabilities approach could help to deepen our understanding of a social problem, namely world poverty. So in the traditional sort of liberal way of looking at measuring poverty, we just think about the wealth that people have. So the older way to say that someone was living in poverty was to see how much money they had available to them to spend per day. So in the top left here, we have a graph that says 2,000 in millions people in the world live on less than $1.25 US dollars per day. So that's nearly 2 billion people who live on less than $1.25 a day. And that gives us some information, but it doesn't give us detailed information on the possibilities that people have available to them. So in the bottom left is something that's more closely aligned with the capabilities approach. There's 10 indicators here. For all of the children in your community that are of school age, what percentage of them are actually enrolled? How many years of schooling are available to them? For the little health section there, what is the child mortality rate in your community or nation? And what nutrition, usually in amount of calories, is available to children especially, but everyone? Then when you move over to the standard of living, do you have cooking fuel available to you? Is there sanitation in your community? What about clean water? Can you own your own assets, your own property? Is there a dirt floor in most people's houses, or an actual floor covering? Do they have access to electricity? So when you take these multidimensional poverty indexes in, then you can move over to the graph on the right, which compares what a purely economic wealth definition of poverty is versus this multidimensional poverty index. And you can see on the top country on the chart, Ethiopia, it says only 40% of people in Ethiopia are living on an income of $1.25 a day or under. But when you look at the multidimensional poverty index, it's 90%. So that means there's not a high school enrollment, there's not many years of schooling available, not much nutrition available, etc., etc. So you can see that the well-being of Ethiopians is probably much more of a crisis than the purely economic factor would have you believe. So when we think about what justifies human rights, in the past it's been God perhaps, or just some natural fact of the way human beings are. But Nussbaum suggests that this idea of human capabilities is at the root of a lot of people's belief in human rights. It's often unstated or implicit, which just means not spelled out. But the understanding that because we have these capabilities of flourishing, we ought to help them develop. So that's what I have here. Another way to put it, because human beings can develop their capabilities, we ought to build a world in which they are able to do so. And that's what morality is, thinking that the world ought to be a certain way. And if we don't do this, we're wasting our potential, both as individuals and as an entire species. So when we have a world where there are many people who are above threshold 1 but below threshold 2, we have a moral duty to change the structure of the world, our governments, our policies, our institutions, to help people flourish better. And then she starts to compare it to utilitarianism, which is, as we've seen, something that has intertwined itself with traditional rights conceptions of freedom and liberty. Consequentialists can say that the development of human potential promotes utility. Why do we need these functionalities of human beings that are common amongst us all? Shouldn't we have the freedom to choose our own good in life, our own goals, our own ends? And this capabilities list sounds like it's a lot more structured than that. Excuse me. Nussbaum says no. And on page 523, she says, polling people concerning the satisfaction of their preferences would miss the obvious fact that desires and subjective preferences are not always reliable indicators of what a person really needs. So this might sound paternalistic or colonial, right? But she has some evidence here as to why this might be the case. So this is at the bottom of page 523. She says, if there's a traditional male-female role split, of course men aren't going to want to take up more domestic chores, and of course both men and women might think it's just natural to have this split. Maybe even more worrisome, the people who are extremely poor and deprived might have never had enough nutrition in their entire life, so they don't even know what it feels like to be healthy. They might think life is just this way. So when you're measuring utility or happiness and you just poll people on it, you're not going to really get the best answer that's possible. So instead, we should measure life quality. And in order to do that, you need a metric. You need a standard with which to judge by. That's what a metric is in this case. So when you just measure life satisfaction, you're supporting the status quo. You're supporting traditions that bar women from going into public when they're menstruating. You are supporting centuries-old oppressions that have turned into laws and traditions, and that the capabilities approach is a lot more oriented to change. Well, what about liberalism? How is the capabilities approach better than liberalism, according to Nussbaum? She gives us 3 ways. First, she says liberalism is only concerned with the distribution of wealth. It can't speak to our values or our goals because it doesn't matter what you use wealth for in liberalism. You just need more of it, more and more and more of it. Freedom to gather resources and goods. And why shouldn't our organizations, political and social, have our values and goals embedded within them? She also says liberalism can't take into account the fact that people have very different needs. In a lot of historical situations, there are oppressed classes, people of color, women, poor people, and they might need more resources. So we need to take into account what people need to flourish in order to distribute resources in a just way. And the third thing is focusing on wealth alone can make it very difficult to figure out why people are failing to flourish, right? Sometimes we get this narrative in our lives that it's the fault of poor people that they're poor and if they just worked hard enough. But if they're living in a society that isn't conducive to go to work, you can think of the very poor, which she focuses on mostly here. Maybe you don't have clean water or access to enough nutrition or education. But you can also think of it in our society. If you are born into a poor family who is too poor to afford a car, that's going to drastically reduce the types of jobs that you can get for most of the country, not necessarily for us. But there are other things that are built structurally into the way we run our society that can impede people from flourishing to their highest capacities. And if you only say wealth, 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 there's no way to see that. Okay, so the next and last few sections of this article is where Nussbaum brings back the relativist objections. She just mentioned them, but now that she has developed her alternative, she can more robustly say why the relativist objections don't work for this methodology, for this capability method. Those relativist objections were that liberalism or the capabilities approach neglects historical and cultural differences, it neglects autonomy, and it's applied in a prejudicial way. So remember that the relativist thinks that the answer always depends on the region and there is no top-down universal way to say, hey, this is the right thing to do and you should do it. And remember that it also comes from a good place, an anti-colonialist place, an anti-exploitation place. And that's one of the reasons why she developed this in such a sensitive way, to make sure that these historical and cultural differences could be applied to each context. She knows that human experience, despite our commonalities, is vastly different for different people. But she does say that this methodology is doubly flexible. It has both plural specification and local specification. Okay, so what this means is in any given community, whether that's in India, whether that's in New York City, whether that's in China. It means that even within a community, people can meet and exceed their capabilities in different ways. So if your goal, to think back to the list, is to have better interpersonal affiliations, some people are going to want to do that maybe through their religion and their churches. Some people are going to want to do that through their hobbies. Some people are going to want to get together and help other people, write books, watch movies, whatever it is. That's what plural specification is. The goal might be somewhat common. There's an underlying goal there, which is to have richer affiliations with other people. But the capabilities method doesn't say which one is right and which one is wrong. Local specification is that between communities, the commonalities can be implemented differently. So now we were thinking about China, New York City, and India. We're going to solve our social issues differently in all three of those places depending on the context. So the lists were generated in order to give this kind of option to as many people as possible. So the second objection from the relativist is that it neglects autonomy. So autonomy is agent-centered. We're all agents if we can make our own choices and follow through on them. And it's a central feature in many people's understanding of what it means to live a good life. If your choices are so constricted that you basically are coerced to get a certain job or stay at home and work there, if you have to do something to get food, if you have to walk 20 miles to get clean water, you have less autonomy than someone who doesn't have to do those things, that has more option, more choice, more information. And Nussbaum says, instead of limiting autonomy, free choice, the capabilities approach actually enhances autonomy. For one, it's the government's job to make sure its citizens have a wider range of choice, not to actually make the choices for them. Just saying if there's universal education, that doesn't mean that everybody has to go to college. The choices, the options are there for a person to reflect on themselves, what they want to do, and choose. Not only that, but practical reasoning is one of the human capabilities that's actually in the list. And practical reasoning, remember, is the ability to plan your own life, to critically reflect on what opportunities and options are available to you, and choose how to spend your life to meet your goals. This is one of the reasons that being able to work outside the home is important for women, because oftentimes they're economically and socially dependent upon their spouse, and they cannot thus plan their own life if they are forced to stay at home. The freedom to work is a very important freedom when it comes to human autonomy. She also says that choice isn't important just because it's choice. So liberalism says freedom of choice, freedom of choice. You have to have all these individual liberties. And okay, that's a good start. But if you don't have any opportunities, all your choices are constricted into whatever's right in front of you. The quality of choice matters as much as the number of choices. So if you can't access learning skills, if you can't access resources, you're not going to be able to make informed and good choices. If you're suffering by an extreme deprivation like hunger, or you're forced into ignorance because there is no education available to you. You have much fewer options. So the capabilities approach enhances autonomy. Okay, what about the prejudicial application of universal rules and laws? And this is a big one. All universal rules and laws about rational man and freedom and liberty and humanity and how we should organize government have been prejudicially applied against people of color, against women, and against poor people. So why should the capabilities approach be any better at liberalism or utilitarianism at promoting the equality of women? She focuses on women because women around the world are still second-class citizens in very many countries. This isn't to say that we couldn't apply it in other instances of oppression. But okay, can't women's humanity still be denied under this capability approach? Can't you just say they don't have some of the things on the list and they don't count as people? She says, in the first place, there's a long history of denials that women are human, yes. But even then, the authors who have created them have always been self-contradictory. Their arguments have always been fragile. And if they're fragile when the entire definition of humanity is rationality, and they said, oh, women aren't rational, wouldn't a wider list of what it means to be a human being protect women's humanity better? She gives a very early defense of women as human beings. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Musonius Rufus was a Stoic thinker in ancient Rome, the 1st century after death. And he made an argument that was kind of like the fulfillment of possible functionality, not quite in the same terms as the capabilities approach. But it doesn't even matter on Rufus's argument if women and men are fundamentally different. The idea is that no matter what your role in life is, you need help to fulfill your function to the highest possible ability. So he did think women's place was running the household and rearing the children, but he thought they needed an education in order to do that as well as possible. She says, and this is on page 530, why do people accept the idea that excuse me, sorry about that, I got a little bit lost here. I skipped ahead in the slides to the next section, wherein someone who was trying to deny the humanity of women can take two positions. Position A, as she says on page 531, says that both males and females have the same general normative list of functions, but they suggest that males and females should exercise these functions in different spheres of life. And this is what Rufus was arguing. He was saying that, yes, okay, we all have the whole list of things, the whole list of functions that human beings have, including wanting affiliation, dying, having a long infancy, all that stuff. But maybe we should do these we're more suited to different spheres of life. And the second position is that, no, men and women have fundamentally different functionality somehow. And even at a high level of generality, these lists of abilities or functions or capabilities should be different for men and women. But the thing is, we don't have enough information to say if there are really any biological structural differences in capabilities. There's a possibility that there are some, but there is so much social construction of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. Right now, we don't have the capability to dig down underneath the social construction to see what exactly our structural difference in capabilities would be. Remember, this isn't talking about strength. This isn't talking about types of reasoning. This is talking about, first and foremost, the ability to reason at all. The mortality, the needing affiliation, the needing to do meaningful work. But what we do know is that the idea of it being natural to have gender roles has directly led to the oppression of women for thousands or hundreds at least of years. But even further, we don't even have solid scientific evidence about any true differences in the mental capacities of men and women. She has some concrete examples if you want to take a look at them on page 532, maybe a little bit before and after as well. So she also says something that is different, obviously, as men are stronger than women. But of course, physical labor as a need that society has been in decline since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. You can even remember in Marx and Engels, they discussed how men, women, and children can all work at factories. Now, in our current world, even military jobs are often, not always, but often more about education than strength. Also, women's work is often disvalued, disrespected, so it's difficult to convince men especially in very traditional societies, to change quickly or at all. So she does say sometimes you can stick to this position A and go for incremental change. So convince both the men and the women in those traditional cultures that it would be better for a woman to work outside the home because it would economically help the whole family, etc. And we can incrementally get to a world with more realized capabilities for women. What about position B? That men and women have different fundamental capabilities. This is saying that that very first list isn't universal. It is different for men and for women. Again, there's a ton of scientific evidence that says that is not the case, especially at the level of generality Nussbaum stuck to. And again, there are specific examples in the article if you want to take a look at it. But she says even if we did have different biologically mandated psychologies, that wouldn't change those common general fundamental functionalities. We would all still die. We would all still need connection and love. We would all still need to work. We would all still need freedom to move around. And these would be our highest ways to be human. And in conclusion, I skipped over some. I don't know. There's some other things I wanted to talk about, but maybe we can do that during a final review. Okay, so as to wrap up, and I realize now how I got a little bit confused because I never gave her conclusion about how even old-style liberal or utilitarian arguments that women aren't human are self-contradictory. And she does talk about it a little back there, but her conclusion here brings it out very clearly. She talks about a treatise that Rousseau wrote. Of course, we looked at some of Rousseau's ideas earlier in the semester. He wrote this treatise on how best to educate an ideal citizen. So you remember, he thinks there should be representative government and everyone should be educated enough so they can understand the difference between personal will and general will. So how do you educate a kid to grow up to be that kind of citizen? His protagonist, his title character, Emile, is prepared from childhood with a robust education and a distaste for traditionally feminine emotion. This is the woman's role. This is her job to take care of the house and the family. And there is a spouse for him in this treatise, in which the female character is taught how to be a woman in this theoretically ideal society. She is only taught, again, how to care for family and home. But, Nussbaum says, neither of them are reaching their full human potential. We want men to flourish, we want women to flourish, and we need both love and reason, or emotion and reason. Empathy, concern, and care for one another, and the ability to practically reason. If you have one but not the other, you are contradicting yourself. You are, even Rousseau says, to live in public life the best, you need empathy for others, which, of course, is an emotion. So the separation of roles isn't good for anybody. We're all marked with a grave functional loss if we neglect some of our human capabilities and focus only on the others. Okay, so now that we've concluded with this article, let's think about where we are in the big picture. So the timeline of the development of political philosophy in the Western world. We touched on Hobbes, but mostly focused on Locke, and at the beginning of liberalism as we know it. And we've seen it grow and shift, meld with utilitarianism, focus more on economic freedom than social freedom. We've seen it become what it is today, in other words, which is often characterized as neoliberalism, the focus on freedom of the market and in exclusion to all the other types of freedom. Of course, there is a strain of liberalism that is more focused on social equality, that has a little bit less sway when it comes to building policy and law. Then we saw a critique of this kind of economically focused political philosophy when we looked at Marx and Engels and their drastic, radical conclusion that we need to eliminate all notions of private property. Meanwhile, in the middle there, we looked at kind of a middle position with Dewey, wherein he realized that if we wanted a truly equal and free society, we need to create opportunity for more people, which means we need to control our economies a little bit more tightly to promote other kinds of values and freedoms. And now in Nussbaum, we've seen a more modern version of this as a critique of both liberalism and utilitarianism, saying that we need to make sure the aims of our government are directed in the right place, toward our goals, toward our morals, toward our values. And if you want to write a journal entry on this piece, the comparative piece is John Adams' letter called Thoughts on Government. I'll put that up alongside these videos. Our last major philosopher will be next week, John Rawls. And he is a contemporary philosopher that tried to integrate the best parts of everything we've studied so far. So we'll talk about him and some of the critiques against him next week. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.